Steve warned me that he wasn't going to tell me what he was going to say, and I'm thankful he didn't. Let me just begin with, Murray had made some comments earlier to start the day, and I have to explain, I'm married to an obstetrician gynecologist, so what I'm going to share with you about being up here at the podium comes partly from that I feel like this talk and this conference has gone way past its due date, and that it's been in my womb for 2.5 years now, and I'm just so grateful to be delivering it finally. So let me just go ahead and begin. The publication of the Red Book occurred in our time, and possibly its publication was also for our time. And it's that subtle difference in the choice of prepositions that in part brings us together here to explore the Red Book for our time. And for me, it raises a number of questions. Was the Red Book ordained to be read at this particular time in human history? Is the Red Book a panacea that can cure all sorts of ills that afflict the postmodern sufferer? Or in other words, is it a prescription for our times? I think sometimes that it's a summons to the reader to fashion their own magnum opus. Or maybe it's simply the chronicle of a wildly imaginative and intensely personal self-examination that should be read more as biography. And of course, it's also perhaps best read as a hermeneutical text that reveals to us the origins of Jung's thinking and his practice. And maybe it should be taken as a set of instructions for those of us who undertake a similar encounter with the self. And it's this last possibility that resonates for me with the name of the subtitle of our conference, Searching for Soul in the 21st Century. And I keep mindful of the fact that Jung's early research in word associations suggests to me that for the last few years, I've noticed that the Red Book is sort of a projective test of its own that may tell us more about the reader than it actually reveals to us simply about the author. And for that reason, I'm going to share a little bit of the impact that the Red Book has had on me personally, and I also intend to share a few stories that I've gathered from my work as an addiction psychiatrist, embedded in a state hospital, a state-supported hospital. And I use the word embedded very intentionally to kind of make reference to the way that journalists become embedded when they accompany soldiers into the battlefield. And I hope I'll be a faithful reporter of what I've seen as an addiction psychiatrist, but I have to confess that I'm not objective like a journalist because I'm also a combatant in that battle. And I hope to demonstrate overall that story in general and myth in particular can serve as antidotes to the postmodern condition that may very well be helping to fuel the current epidemic of substance use. Now, I wish to confess to you, I've not read, despite what Steve said, and he's not wrong, I do read voraciously, but curiously, I've not read the Red Book from cover to cover like I read most books. I've read significant portions of the text. I've certainly read quite a few of the explanatory notes, and mostly I've allowed myself to just be moved by the evocative images and the symbols, and I've tried to let them soak through me. But one thing I have done is that I've allowed the book to be my occasional companion. And interestingly, I celebrated my 52nd birthday in the same month that the Red Book was released. And within a few years of its release, I had what Jungians often describe as a big dream, and I'm going to share a portion of that dream with you. In this dream, the world was a very dark and foreboding domain. And I was exhilarated to discover that I could float and kind of hover and glide over the terrain. But the Earth's surface was parched and crusted over and lifeless. It was really as if Zoe, or life itself, was on the decline. And I was carrying with me a staff, at the end of which it had been honed to a sharp point. And there was a moment in the dream where I felt very moved that I was being called to a very important role in a very large drama that I didn't understand. But the task that was given to me was simply to take that staff and to pierce the ground with it. And wherever I did that, what would happen was that the earth would break apart, and almost like lava flows look like, there would be fissures that grew from that spot where I had driven in the staff, from which golden light began to stream forth and spread out, which then transformed into a sort of green luminescent light. And what I saw was it was spreading out in all directions. And this happened numerous times in the dream where I hovered to a new spot and the same thing occurred. There was also an element of danger in the dream, and it felt as though others were lurking in the vicinity and trying to discover not only what I was up to, but they had an intention to stop me from doing it. I continued moving about and doing the task, using the staff to pierce the desiccated earth, and somehow I became very aware in the dream that what I was doing was healing the earth and bringing some sort of incalculable benefit to the world around me. So like I've done with the Red Book, I held that dream as a powerful companion, just waiting to see if it might reveal itself and its meaning to me. I was mostly overtaken by the awareness that I'd been called. But of course, as often happens, I had no idea what is it that I was being called to. Though I will say, from time to time came back that thought of that's been inscribed on the transom of 228 Strasse, that called or not called, the God will be there. And it wasn't very long after that that Murray Stein and Nathan Schwartz-Salant, may he rest in peace, invited Steve and I to take the helm of Chiron Publications. And it was in that period shortly after that invitation came to us that the dream came back to me with a vengeance. And I now began to feel like that was going to be the call, that somehow it was taking shape in my outer life. And that with each book that we published, just like each instance where I had driven that staff down into the desiccated, dying earth, that just possibly from that publication of a book, there might go forth ripples of hope. And from each of those, maybe a current might build that might have the capacity to sweep down even the mightiest of walls of oppression and resistance and ignorance. And so, to a great extent, that's a big part of the origin story of how I came to be a book publisher in the middle of my life. So 5 more years passed from that time, and Steve and I answered another call. We left a thriving private practice to begin working at a government-supported inpatient facility that specializes in the treatment of addicts and alcoholics. And in that setting, we no longer took care of people who were well-heeled and who could afford to be in therapy. They didn't have resources. Our patients were now those that were unwashed, uninsured, and unhoused. They were addicts. And so these days, I have the privilege of working with patients of all ages from many, many walks of life who've actually lived through the ravaging of their life and having had their lives be dismembered by the corrosive effects of illicit drug use. And it was before the pandemic, when we still gathered in large groups, that I gave a talk to the patients at the hospital where we work. And the theme of the talk was to try and elucidate for the folks in the audience how it is that the elements of storycraft resemble the process of psychotherapy. So I invited the audience and the participants to recognize that each of us edits the narrative of our life. And I went on to explain that in many ways, we weave together the meaningful episodes in our lives, and we assemble them as though they're broken pieces of time, kairos. And at times, something may happen in a life that causes us to revise the narrative, and that new scenes appear for us in our narrative, often assembled from the same details and the same historical events. And I pointed out that there are other times when we might actually recruit the assistance of a professional counselor that in some ways you could liken to a professional editor, and that person can help fashion a different narrative. Well, I proposed to the group that the most compelling sorts of stories are typically those that are able to connect the protagonist's personal story to a larger story, one that has universal or redemptive themes. And so in order to illustrate that, I briefly recounted the myth of Demeter and Persephone, but keeping in mind that many of the people in the audience, in the place where we work, have suffered serious trauma. After the talk, a young woman came up to me, lingering behind, and she asked if she could speak with me. And when the crowd had dissipated, she declared in a very passionate way, "That was my story." She went on to explain to me that her parents were divorced when she was quite young, and that as a preteen, she had gone to live with her father in a different city so that she could enroll in a better school than the one that was available to her where her mother had lived. And her father had begun sexually abusing her. And that abuse continued throughout the school years for several years in a row. And each year, when spring arrived, her father, who was a very avid outdoorsman apparently, would lose interest in his daughter, and she would then return to the care of her mother. So again, she said to me, "I'm Persephone." She shared with me that at the end of summer each year, as the end approached and preparations were made for her to return to her father, she felt like she was being abducted and taken into a dead underworld where her spirit would wither. And when her father lost interest in her in the spring and she was sent back to her mother, she felt as though she came back to life. Well, over the remainder of that woman's 2-week hospitalization, she sought me out. And Steve didn't explain, but because I'm the chief medical officer, I don't usually have an assignment of having patients for whom I'm actually there attending. So she had to go out of her way when I would be strolling around the hospital grounds to hunt me down to tell me how she was doing. And she reported to me that she was feeling astoundingly better and that she was very encouraged about her future. And in the very last meeting that we had, she revealed to me that her view of her mother had now become entirely different. That for years, she had been angry and furious at her mother, who herself had been a victim of sexual abuse, and she simply couldn't comprehend how somebody who themselves had suffered sexual abuse could permit their daughter to be subjected to what she went through. But in the course of that, she also admitted to me that it had never occurred to her that she never spoke up and never told her mother about what was happening. Somehow, my retelling that myth catalyzed a really surprising reaction. She'd had an entirely new appreciation for her mother, and she told me how she now realized that not really was it that her mother had sent her to sacrifice like a lamb to slaughter, but that in fact, her mother had been the one who restored her each spring. I think it was the depth and the breadth of this woman's healing experience that really took me by surprise. Again, because I wasn't her attending physician. She maybe sought me out 2 or 3 times for a 2 or 3 minute interaction with me. And then the last interaction, which I'm certain didn't last more than 10 minutes. But it was that vignette and a few other similar stories that prompted my interest in the role of myth, initiation rituals, and how that might be woven into the treatment of addiction. And we know that throughout history, there's records of the evidence of our use of intoxicants, but mostly within a sacramental context. Through ritual ingestion, typically under the supervision of others, a celebrant would be guided towards meaningful experiences that would quicken them and bring them perhaps to ecstatic states. In fact, the word that's now become popular to describe psychedelics, entheogens, which is the broad class of those substances, comes from the root word in Greek of entheos, being possessed by God or inspired. But for the most part, substance use in the postmodern era has been purged of any connection to that mythopoetic or sacramental realm. And while people often remember their first drink or their first occasion of substance use, it's virtually never as a part of a ritualized use that might be considered sacrament. So I submit to you that addicts are people adrift, and that when they experience the intensification, or even for that matter, the dulling of emotions and perceptions and consciousness that's brought on by psychoactive substances, they don't have the support around them of a socially and spiritually meaningful backdrop to help incorporate that experience. But nevertheless, many addicts and alcoholics do eventually embrace a mythic dimension to their life. They begin to perceive themselves as outcasts and marginalized people enslaved to their substance. There's a sort of anti-hero identity that often coalesces, and without a connection to a larger story that has a healthy organizing motif, the addict eventually is condemned to a cycle of repeated efforts to either recover that initial state of ecstasy or the desire to avoid the pains of withdrawal. And I want to be clear that whatever psychological interpretations we can give to addiction, I don't want to ignore the fact that in many instances, but not with all substances, the tolerance and withdrawal that develops after continued use perpetuates the addiction. But I'm going to suggest that there's a common feature among the individuals who find themselves in the throes of addiction that goes way beyond the physiologic dependence. It involves things like social isolation, criminal activity, reckless behavior, and a singular focus on subduing the cravings that become a hallmark feature of addiction. And for some, that journey from a naive seeker to an initiate into the world of addiction inevitably leads to the abyss of full-throated addiction. And let's remember even the root word from which addiction comes, addictus. It refers to being a debtor and a bondservant to a creditor. And when the creditor is an intoxicant, a person becomes a bondservant to that relentless pursuit of an ecstatic moment or the pursuit of relief from the misery provoked by abstinence. Aristotle wrote in Politics, "It is the nature of desire not to be satisfied, and most human beings live only for the gratification of it." So my work with addiction repeatedly confirms my belief that human beings have a fundamental and inborn desire for God. I quote here from a speaker at an AA meeting that I attended back in 2021, and his personal story is that he began drinking at the age of 10 and became sober by the age of 16. And here's what he had to say, quote, "I had a hunger for something deeper, and I knew it was God as much as a 9-year-old can understand God. After the first few times that he got drunk," he said, "I quickly concluded that alcohol was the thing missing in my life." And he went on to say, "I spent countless hours thinking about drinking, planning to drink on the weekends, and that was what made it worthwhile. And alcohol allowed me to get by and get through the week by the time I was 12. Let me briefly retell a couple of the variations of the story of Dionysus. As you recall, Dionysus is the twice-born god. And I'm hoping to establish that there's some connection between those Dionysian traits, the descent into addiction, and perhaps the path to recovery. So the first version I'll tell briefly is, as you know, Dionysus was the child of Zeus and Semele, a mortal woman. And Hera, the ever-jealous goddess, insisted that Semele prove the divine paternity of the child that she carried within her womb. And so Semele asked Zeus to reveal himself in order that she could prove who was the father of her child. However, in doing so, she gazed upon his visage, and that caused her to be destroyed. And Zeus rushed to save his unborn son by sewing the infant into his own thigh, where Dionysus finished his gestation and was eventually born, and thus the twice-born god who rules over wine in the festive orgy of rites. And then in a different Orphic account of Dionysus, he was the son of Zeus and his daughter Persephone. And Hera had Dionysus torn to pieces and cooked and eaten by the Titans. However, Athena saved Dionysus's heart and returned him to life through the union of Zeus and Semele. Zeus sent his lightning bolts down on the Titans, and from their ashes, the first humans were formed. In both these versions, Dionysus is destroyed and reconstituted. And even Orpheus himself suffers the fate of being torn apart and dismembered. The motif is frequent as relates to the wine god. When we talk about something being Dionysian, we're mostly alluding to its sensual, passionate, spontaneous, and unrestrained features, in contrast to those Apollonian qualities that refer to the order and structure and self-discipline and rationality. Moreover, mad excess and sensual indulgence are what characterize that Dionysian aspect of the psyche. Addicts and alcoholics, whose lives have been torn apart by the titanic forces of addiction and upended, become dismembered from their community. And they become dismembered from the very things that once tethered them to society before addiction. Their work, their relationships, their leisure activities, they all suffer. So truly, the addict is a dismembered creature. They even become dismembered in the way that they perceive their own selves and are incapable of valuing themselves. So when an addict becomes absorbed in their recovery, they often speak in terms of having a rebirth that bears striking resemblance to the twice-born God. And curiously, despite their surrender of their will to the bondservant, being a bondservant to the drug, they retain an astounding degree of willfulness and self-absorption. And addicts and alcoholics readily will deny the gravity of their situations, even in the face of obvious evidence. As I mentioned earlier, addicts and alcoholics adopt a sort of anti-hero mythology, and the addict's anti-hero journey follows a similar trajectory as the one that Joseph Campbell condensed in A Hero of a Thousand Faces as having three stages: the stage of departure, initiation, and return. So let's explore each of those. The departure for an addict ensues when they become disaffected with ordinary life, where they find relief from the toil of daily existence through the reliance on an intoxicant. Illicit drugs propel the addict into a strangely alluring world in which the very act of using is often illegal. They also depart from conventional life and find themselves in a realm accompanied by derelicts, criminals, criminal activity, and other addicts who have little regard for conventional values and customs. And added to this is the mystique about the lethality of certain illicit drugs. For instance, synthetic opioids like fentanyl fueled a spike in overdose deaths that in 2020 resulted in the death of over 100,000 Americans, twice what we lost in the Vietnam War. I've had addicts tell me how they sought out bad batches of heroin and fentanyl, knowing that they had been causing overdoses in their communities. And sometimes I would ask why they would do that, because it seems so inexplicable. And the stories are usually a very strange combination of powerful craving for a more intense high and that anti-heroic battle with death. Seldom are they framed as victories over death. More often, they take on the characteristics of a wager, in which the binary outcomes are the promise of a supremely intense high or the surrender to death that would finally bring release from the vicious cycle of addiction. And then there's the initiation. As for initiation, many people report the first drink, their first use of a drug, often their first time injecting a drug like opioids or methamphetamine, in very romanticized ways. And this is nothing new. In the United States, the pendulum repeatedly swings between vilifying the intemperate soul and glorifying the sensual and highly subjective flights brought about by drugs like opium and cocaine. Authors like Thomas de Quincey, in Confessions of an English Opium Eater, championed a particular kind of drug use, recreational use, that in that day was called luxurious use. De Quincey was the prototypical addicted and tortured genius. He presented himself as a sort of Orpheus figure who had charted his own course into his own psychic hell and back. And many figures of the Romantic era developed opium habits. They included people like Shelley, Barrett Browning, Keats, Coleridge. Nearly 30 years after the publication of Confessions of an English Opium Eater, Fitzhugh Ludlow published Confessions of a Hashish Eater, in which he glorified the sublime peaks to which hash could transport the user. Though he later decried the terrible mental bondage that he suffered through his use of opium. So this romantic strain continues to course through the substance use even here in the 21st century. And it makes me wonder if the stultifying, soul-crushing influence of technology, social media, and maybe lately the pandemic, have they added to the allure of that romanticized anti-heroic aspect of addiction? Initiation into addiction is sometimes evident from the very first encounter. And the most compelling illustration I have of that is a story that a woman recounted to me during my initial assessment of her, in which she said, I had simply asked, when was your first use? And she said, my daddy shot me up the first time when I was 13. He was a heroin addict too, and he taught me how to shoot up safely. Oddly, there was something very warm and affectionate in the way she recounted this encounter, in which her father was portrayed more like a sacramental sponsor during baptism. From that day onward, she'd continued using opioids almost daily, and she prided herself on her ability to survive on the streets and boasted that the streets themselves had raised her, not her parents. She was a master at operating outside the rules of society. And her passage through adolescence into young adulthood was a vivid and poignant example of the kind of anti-hero story. And like many anti-hero stories, her backstory was crucial to understanding how she'd ended up so identified with the anti-hero. So let's move on to the stage of return. And I'd like to just ask the audience, how many of you are familiar with the 12 steps and 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous? How many of you could actually recite any of them besides the first one? Well, there's a handful of people who could recite a few of them. Could I have the slide? I'm going to post a slide with both if I did it right, they'll flip between the 12 steps and the 12 traditions so that you'll be able to see both, because I'm going to make reference to them. If you could, yes. There we go. So I'm now going to focus on Alcoholics Anonymous and the ways in which that fellowship of suffering alcoholics provides a path of return. I'm going to use AA generically here to refer to Alcoholics Anonymous and any other of the myriad 12-step programs that have now evolved from that original. I contend, oops. Thank you. I contend that the full flowering of postmodernity in the 21st century visited certain maladies and afflictions on us that relate to the death of myth, the death of God, and the forfeiture of meaningful rites and rituals. So the addict's journey, as illuminated by AA, reflects that anti-hero journey in the stages of departure, initiation, and return. And in fact, when one is successfully immersed in the program of AA, it provides a sort of roadmap for each of those stages. And if, like Dionysus, a person's addiction leaves them dismembered, AA holds the promise of being remembered. All it takes is to work the steps, embrace the 12 traditions, and most of all, avoid drinking one day at a time. And taken more broadly, the reintroduction of myth, rites, and rituals that pervade AA are a prescription for our time and part of the postmodern search for soul. The burgeoning research and science of addiction continues to tell only part of the story. And I think it's here where analytical psychology may have something unique to offer. We're discovering that many mental illnesses, ranging from mood disorders to thought disorders, share an underlying pathophysiology that involves the inflammatory process. And perhaps in a similar fashion, various illnesses that we subsume under the heading of substance use disorders share an underlying psychopathology rooted in that deconstructed, highly subjective, media-driven, fragmented life that's present in the modern age. And if that's so, then reintroduction of myths, rites of initiation, and meaningful rituals may certainly have a place in recovery. And AA furnishes some of these missing ingredients with what's become a very well-worn path that's been traveled by countless alcoholics and later addicts since its formation in 1935. In 12-step recovery groups, the first step invites an honest admission of our complete and utter powerlessness in the face of addiction. The exact wording being, we admitted to ourselves that we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. This sort of emptying of self-will and pride and ceaseless self-justification is what opens the door to a new life, one that's now lived in fellowship with others and one that also has renewed purpose. This is akin to the remembering that Dionysus underwent to become the twice-born God. And in the second step of AA, it points directly to something missing for the postmodern individual. The second step reads, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. The postmodern individual has no choice but to come up with an answer in the aftermath of Zarathustra's proclamation that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? In this postmodern era, self-reliance and superficial social connections become merged with an abandonment of traditional myths and rites and rituals. And this creates a rich environment for that romantic promise of substance use to be able to take root and flourish. Perhaps because of this, the remedies for the alcoholic and addict should attempt to modulate and ameliorate the psychopathology of the postmodern condition, which is at its core involving a disavowal and disconnection from the numinous. Here too, AA has developed a proven and time-tested method. And furthermore, I contend that the Red Book offers additional clues about a remedy. But new entrants to the fellowship of AA are often encouraged to remove themselves from the company of others who use drugs or drink. In fact, they're often invited to attend 90 meetings in 90 days as a way of installing and forging a habit of meeting attendance. Again, the formula becomes very simple for sober living. It's simply attend meetings, abstain from the use one day at a time, engage in service to others, and admit your wrongs, and when possible, make them right. And then finally, how to cultivate these principles in all your affairs. So one fruit of the AA path that's captured in the 12th step is having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. Long-term recovery is like a second birth. AA provides a path marked by the surrender of self-will in step 1, an invitation to its relationship with the numinous in steps 2, 3, 7, and 11, an honest self-examination reflected in steps 4 and 8, confession in steps 5 and 10, a redemption and restitution in steps 6, 8, and 9, and finally a quality of evangelism in step 12. For those who don't know the history, AA was founded in 1935, and it has a rich history that's been preserved mostly through oral transmission. But then came the big book that's really a collection of narratives and stories and a little bit of theory about what makes an alcoholic. And it quickly obtained the stature of wisdom literature in this fledgling fellowship. And although apocryphal stories abound, they generally remain true to the message of AA, whose singular mission is to help the suffering alcoholic. Together, these features, along with the 12 steps program, are there to make a promise to the alcoholic, who now is thought of as being fortunate, because since 1935, there is a way that leads back to being remembered. The similarities to Dionysus and his dismembering and rebirth through divine intervention suggest to me that there's a deeper and collective something at play in AA and related groups. And we know that Jung exchanged letters with Bill Wilson, a founding member of AA. And in those letters, were revealed some of the details of his care and treatment of Roland H., who had been a patient of Jung's, who eventually freed himself from alcoholism. This, along with the Oxford group, which was had a shaping influence on the formation of AA, and has now become codified in the 12 steps and the 12 traditions. So on a few occasions, I've actually used the stories of Dionysus's dismemberment and rebirth and recounted them to patients. And to someone who suffered their own acute dismemberment of their life and the severance from society that they used to keep before addiction, the retelling of that story occasionally provides a way of meaningfully connecting to their excess in addiction to a larger, higher order narrative. In my retelling of the stories, I emphasize that Dionysus was the god of wine, sensuality, and excess. I point out that entire cults grew up around the worship of Dionysus, many of which involved ritualized death and rebirth. And then I draw parallels to the modern use of intoxicants that can also bring on quasi-ecstatic states or death. And if at that point the listener is at all receptive, I emphasize that in ancient cultures, there were guides for such experiences. And I point out that in those times, encounters with powerful intoxicants existed within a framework that was sacramental. And regarding Dionysus's second birth, I underscore that he too was torn to pieces and dismembered. But more importantly, I mention that even Dionysus needed the intervention of a divine being to be restored to life. Or in the language of AA's second step, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And at that point, I've witnessed patients who began to reflect on their own dismemberment. They'd talk about the material things they've lost, the loss of their self-esteem brought on by addiction, or the profound alienation that has resulted from their use. Now, I want to be clear. I eschew simple approaches, and I'm not proposing that simply retelling a story from antiquity that has certain similarities to the addict's journey, it will reliably evoke a healing response. However, I do believe that for the addict, some connection between their story and the numinous realm is a vital feature of what heals. There's a researcher who's very prominent in psychedelic therapy research these days, who has observed that even after psychedelic experiences, there are many people who carry with them a lingering and profound impact from those brief encounters. And he describes it as they are dope slapped out of their story. Dope slapped out of their story. To be slapped out of one story or slapped into a larger story with more universal themes may very well be one of the most powerful treatments that a therapeutic elixir contains. And bringing the universal and collective dimensions of intrapsychic life to the attention of a patient can be a powerful gift. It's an offering both to the patient and, in my opinion, to the gods. The woman who saw herself in Persephone was slapped out of that solitary, demoralizing story of abuse and neglect that had defined her life. And she was slapped into a story in which she recognized her mother as a rescuer, and she found a jewel in the wound that transmuted her feelings of abandonment into a sense of being a person worthy of being saved and restored each spring. So she really was Persephone, who, having been ravaged, could also be restored. So I ask, what has any of this to do with Jung's Red Book? And furthermore, have I made any case that supports that the Red Book is truly for our times? How should those of us who recognize the value of attending to the process of individuation respond to the postmodern death of God, the disappearance of myths and rituals? The delay in publishing the Red Book makes me wonder if all along the book was a message for posterity. For me, the Red Book illustrates the journey of one man who traversed the territory where personal and collective forces clash. Without the benefit of analysis, when the tectonic plates of the personal and the unconscious and the collective unconscious collide, it's very easy for one of them to be subducted under the other. When the collective unconscious slides beneath the plane of the personal, we lose contact with the numinous. And maybe we become more susceptible to that siren song of addiction. And when the reverse happens and the personal unconscious is subducted beneath the collective too thoroughly, there is the danger of inflation to the point of psychotic distortion. So when I read or simply keep company with the Red Book and think of it as something for our time, I'm challenged to try and align my own personal myth with the collective myths. It invites me to craft my own Red Book, like the authors of AA's Big Book must have done when they enshrined their discoveries about sober living in the big book so that posterity would have that available. But I recognize that the red book that I create will not be filled with exquisite renderings of my inner symbolic life, though it inevitably will be part biography, part confession, part guide for the perplexed. And perhaps like Jung's red book, my red book will be, at the very least, the account of one man's journey of self-discovery and self-deceit as he endeavored to invite encounters with the figures who populate the depths of his own soul. In fact, I've actually begun to think that eventually my red book may simply be a compilation of other people's writings that I helped, like a midwife, to bring into print. And if that's the case, I'm confident that I will have responded to that call that first presented itself in my big dream. My recent efforts have been directed more towards harmonizing those parts of my personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. And on those occasions when it happens that I succeed, I begin to glimpse just how much the red book could, in fact, be a prescription for our time. Regardless of whether the metaphoric red book any of us create takes shape in the form of a book, a career, a marital relationship, a lifetime of partnership with a friend, a piece of art, a collection of journal entries gathered over many years, the end result and the effect it produces on us will in fact be for our time if it fuels individuation. If that deep call goes unanswered, or if we're never able to find any way to connect our personal narrative to a larger drama, then the relief from the suffering of our postmodern condition promised by drugs and alcohol becomes ever more alluring. Lately, I've even attempted to revive the pantheon of gods and goddesses in my own daily life, or as we heard yesterday, to re-enchant my world. Sometimes before I send an email, I call upon Hermes, asking that my message be delivered swiftly and effectively. At times, I literally petition Calliope for inspiration for something that I might be attempting to write. And I don't know if there was ever a time when these kinds of regular petitions to the gods were part of everyday life. But I've often wondered what happens to the gods when their worshipers all die off, or when they no longer are remembered by living human beings. Are there any avenues left for the postmodern individual to meaningfully connect to the numinous through myth, rites, and rituals? There seems to be a hunger, and maybe even a need to be taken up by passionate, ecstatic reverie. At times, the quickest route to that is to achieving that sort of numinous encounter is the use of an intoxicant. So I even go as far as to look for opportunities to enter into conversation with God and gods, and I sometimes even cast certain daily affairs as though they are rites and rituals. And I'll give you an example. It wasn't very long ago that my hospital recruited and hired a young, very well-trained addiction psychiatrist. If you had been watching on the surface, what you would have seen is I took very special care to the little details. We had his office painted before he arrived. I made sure that his computer was up and running. I purchased business cards with his name on them and had them in the office before he arrived. And I ensured that his onboarding, as we say, went smoothly. But all the while, I stayed alert for the opportunities to look for little examples of how these could also be initiatory rites. Time will tell, but I hope that what I did by honoring those rituals and rites, it might have bound him more closely to the fellowship of the medical staff where we work. And I owe a great deal to Neil Gaiman, if anybody has read American Gods, for that idea of reviving the gods and goddesses in my life. His book inspired me to look for an answer personally to what becomes of the gods when there's nobody left to worship them. Did Ra, Zeus, or even Yahweh cease to exist when their worshipers perished or moved on? Freud may very well have been right when he postulated in Future of an Illusion that God is a projection of our infantile impulses. But Jung was also correct in proposing that there are universal collective features to the gods like Ra, Zeus, and Yahweh that point to an implicate order. Jung understood that the psyche's substrata is rich with symbols and populated by archetypes that are a priori inflection points within the psyche that gather to themselves energy, images, and experiences. I've been moved as well by John Van Eyck's ideas that he expressed in Clinical Chaos regarding the strange attractors of childhood trauma. And it offers me an insight into the way that the inflection points in the psyche begin to shape the contours of our inner life. So for me, this is a profound and compelling message of the Red Book, that it really is for our times. And in this postmodern era, when the center does not hold, when gods have been deconstructed, and when even how we talk about gods, myths, and rituals is being deconstructed, the Red Book appeared on the scene as a testament to the fact that the rational and the irrational dimensions of the psyche can be transcended. And when this is achieved, a person may be freed from the tyranny of childhood and childish God images, and they may be able to withstand a full surrender to Orgia. By 1930, when Jung completed the Red Book, modernity was receding and postmodernity was dawning. The Red Book presaged that what was to come and how thorough the deliberate and courageous engagement of our inner life can offer hope that would equip us to be able to fashion a new God image that had both universal and personal dimensions. For the residents of the postmodern industrialized nations, the malaise and existential afflictions of the 21st century seem to be ubiquitous. And yet, not everyone is susceptible to addiction. So I don't want to overstate this. We can't make a direct and causal link between postmodern life and the current epidemic of addiction, not with any degree of confidence. And furthermore, addicts and alcoholics have been around throughout history. But what we can say is that there exists within us a deep hunger for authentic engagement with the numinous that can easily be misdirected when there are readily accessible and powerful intoxicants like we have today. If postmodernity has ushered in a period of barren, hollow, existentially despairing existence, then the temptation to indulge in pleasurable, addictive behaviors as a substitute for the real encounters with the numinous can certainly be expected to continue increasing. None of us can know for sure whether we ourselves are susceptible to addiction, but perhaps dedicating oneself to the creation of a masterwork, a Red Book of our own design, in which there's a dialogue between our personal and collective unconscious, is a cure for our times. So I've witnessed firsthand how the dismembered souls of people who battle addiction are born anew when a dialogue opens up between their personal story and the universal aspects of ancient myths, or even those of modern movements like AA. My work with addicts is teaching me to remain alert for ways that I can forge similar connections. And Jung's Red Book continues to reveal to me how precious it can be to not only undertake the work of individuation, but also how important it can be to keep a record of that journey as we take that journey in search of soul. So thank you.